Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, and we're going to talk about form. God, I love talking about form. The form we're talking about is that of the Baroque Concerto, the Ritornello form of the Baroque Concerto, because there are two kinds of Baroque concertos. There is the Concerto Grosso, as codified by Corelli, which is basically a concerto for two unequal groups of instruments. In Corelli's case, it was a big bunch of strings and a small bunch of solo strings. And that kind of concerto existed side by side with the later Ritornello concerto, which is the one that we're talking about. That one evolved more or less in and around Venice. Its greatest original practitioner was our dear friend Vivaldi. And those concertos usually have three movements. A concerto grosso can have any number from, just 2 to like 8. It doesn't make any difference. It's just a sequence of similar tonality, a terrible word, works in the similar key, basically, or closely related keys of quick and slow, however many you want. But Vivaldi's concerto form was fast, slow, fast. It was the concerto form that became the modern concerto form, and it still is the modern concerto form. And that evolved in the first decades of these 1700s of the 18th century. And that's the form we're going to talk about because it was so important for what came later. Really, really, really important. And its essence is quite simple. But what you have to know about any kind of form is that once I tell you what the template is, forget about it. You have to understand the underlying principle. The actual template, the rule, is more honored in the breach, and you're going to hear that too. We have 5 scintillating examples by Handel, Vivaldi, and Bach that we're going to be listening to that are going to explain to you everything you need to know about this form. And what's more, once you know what the form is, once you know what the parameters are, that old saw that like Vivaldi wrote the same concerto 500 times, or that all Baroque music sounds the same, or all Baroque concertos are the same, that goes right out the window because you'll be able to tell a composer of genius from a hack. And it all has to do with how they handle the form. The first thing you need to know now is that the Baroque concerto form arose out of the operatic aria, the Baroque aria, the classic da capo aria. Now, da capo means back to the beginning, or from the top, or from the head, literally. And that kind of an aria has an A-B-A form. You have an A section, and then a middle section, and then the A section comes back and gives the singer a chance to ornament and improvise and theoretically display their virtuosity. And I think that, and taste. And I think the taste part really was probably pretty theoretical from everything we know about how these people actually behaved. But that's not the point. The form of the da capo aria is very interesting because the A section begins with a tune, and that tune is called a ritornello. And a ritornello is called a ritornello because it returns. It keeps coming back. It comes back at various points. It returns. A ritornello. How obvious. How clear. So the A section is going to start with a ritornello, and then the singer is going to sing the first bit of text, and then the ritornello will come back to end the A section, and then the B section will happen, and it's usually shorter than the A section and in a contrasting key, often in a minor key if the words get gloomier. And then the A section comes back. So you have the ritornello, then the singer does their thing again with more ornamentation, and then the whole thing ends with the ritornello. And notice what you get when you do this. You have 3 major singing bits framed by 4 statements of the ritornello. Now, the singing bits are not based on nothing. The singing bits can either use bits of the ritornello, they can sing all of it, they can sing bits of it, or they can have completely fresh material, or any combination of that. Any combination at all. And of course, the middle section is completely different. So I'm going to play you an aria. The aria is by Handel. It comes from his cantata, Aminta e Filide, whatever you call it, also known as Arresta il Passo, or Stop, Cool it, Knock it off, something like that. It doesn't matter. This is a great aria. What is it called? It's called Fiamma Bella, I believe it's called. Oh, yes, beautiful flame. And the words are designed to allow the composer to write two independent sections, an A section and a B section. The A section, this is what's called a simile aria. It's like, just as what happens when such and such, if that happens, then something and something. And so it's like the lover who's abandoned. It's having a symbolism in nature that relates to the human situation that's going on in the cantata or the opera or whatever it happens to be. So the words to this one are basically, oh, beautiful flame, if the east wind blows funkily, then you go off track, and if you speak to me harshly, then my heart will be broken and the world will come to an end, and that's it. But you have these two lines. You have the beautiful flame and the wind blowing along, and then you have the, oh, if things go horribly, then I'll drop dead. So you have these two separate thoughts, which can be embodied one in the A section, one in the B section, which in this case will be in a minor key. So when I play all of these pieces, I'm going to tell you where the ritornellos are and where the solo parts are. And I'm going to play you now the entire aria, all 5 minutes of it. It's beautiful. This performance is with Contrasto Armonico, directed by Marco Vitali on the Brilliant Classics label. And the soprano is someone whose name I can't pronounce, but she's very, very good. And that's all we need to know about her. She really is very, very good. Should I give it a shot? Her name is Clartia van Veldhoven or something like that, but she sounds lovely. And this is such a beautiful, beautiful aria. And the ritornello you may have heard before. If you know your Handel, you'll know this. But this was the original version of it. Here it is. So, you heard the A section, you heard the middle section in a minor key, sounding a little more depressed, and the return of the A section ornamented. But the important thing to note, the really important thing to note, is that you heard the ritornello, then you heard the solo part where the singer is singing, interspersed with bits of the ritornello between phrases because the singer has to breathe. And the singer's relationship to the ritornello is different in every single instance practically. The singer can sing the whole thing, sing only bits of it. The singer can have independent material entirely, and the ritornello can be an accompaniment. There's an infinite number of ways that the composer can relate the solo to the big tune with which the aria begins. But you have ritornello, song, ritornello, middle section, ritornello, song, ritornello. So what does that add up to? What it adds up to is 3 big solo episodes framed by 4 statements of the ritornello, either completely or almost completely. Sometimes it's not entirely complete, but in this case it is. In this case, you hear the whole thing. And, oh, what a catchy tune. Handel loved the tune. He reused it. It became Ogni Vento in Agrippina, his great Italian opera, the climax of his career in Italy before he left for England. And he reused it. And he reused just the ritornello with completely different solo bits and B sections in several other works. Fascinating, because that ritornello, as you may have heard, has separate components that Handel can use. There's the opening, da-da-dum-bum-ba-dum, and then there's that merry-go-round tune, ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum-bum-bum-ba. Well, you've got wonderful material from which to construct a movement. But the point I want to make, the point that is so fascinating, is that the forms of these arias and of the Baroque concerto, the 3-movement ritornello concerto, are exactly the same. Absolutely the same, because the template for the Baroque concerto in ritornello form is 3 solo episodes framed by 4 statements of the ritornello. 1 at the beginning, 1 at the end, and 2 in the middle, as sort of pillars propping up the structure. And these can appear in different keys and things can happen to them and they can be fragmented in different ways. But that's the template. 3 solos, 4 ritornellos, 7 parts in total. Now, because this is not a da capo aria situation, there's not a singer like a real singer, but there's actually an instrumentalist, you don't get the da capo aria form. In other words, the composer doesn't write the A section, the B section, then right at the end of the B section, go repeat the A section. In these movements, for instruments, the different sections are written out in various degrees of fullness. This being the Baroque period, there was always room to improvise everywhere. But basically, it has to be entirely written out. There are no sections that are simply pro forma repeats. But the form is otherwise the same. It's this 7-section form. And to prove it, I am now going to play you the first movement of Vivaldi's Concerto in D minor for oboe. This is RV 454. And this is just a lovely concerto. It's wonderful. And these movements are still pretty short. They're just 2, 3, 4 minutes long. We're not talking about huge, crazy stuff here. But this wonderful movement does exactly what that aria does. You will hear for yourself a ritornello, a solo, another ritornello, another solo, another ritornello, a longer solo. The 3rd solo is the longest and most developed of all of them, and finally a ritornello. But there are a couple other things I want you to keep in mind when listening to this. The first thing is that during the solos, the orchestra participates too, and there may be moments when the solo drops out and the orchestra interjects. They go back and forth. It's a concerto. They're working with each other. Sometimes they're getting along harmoniously. Sometimes they're in dialogue. Sometimes they're in dispute. The relationship between solo and orchestra is a constantly changing and evolving thing. And that's what makes the ritornello form so marvelous. It's absolutely marvelous, because in addition to the relationship between the ritornello itself and the solo, you have how the solo gets along with the orchestra during its solo bits. And in Vivaldi's case, this third solo is the one that has the most developed stuff going on, although it's still quite brief. And I'm going to indicate what each section is in all of these examples, so you can just follow along with it as it plays, and you'll know where you have a solo and where you have a not solo, which in the case of an oboe concerto is very, very easy, because you have all strings in the oboe. So when the oboe's playing, it's a solo. When it isn't playing, it's a ritornello. It's really that simple. So let's listen to this movement. It's about 2 minutes and 58 seconds, I think, something like that. And you'll hear how the ritornello and solo episodes shake out, just as in the Handel aria we just heard. Simple, right? Now, one other thing I'd like you to notice, and I want to point out, is that ritornello, that wonderful ritornello, could not possibly belong to an opera because it has no tunes. It's essentially instrumental formula. It's a syncopated rhythm followed by some descending chromatic scales in D minor. It's the kind of thing that's specifically written for instruments to play. Now, the oboe part, the solo part, is inherently more melodic and more expressive. It's the solo. It's imitating the voice. But the material that it gets, and this is what makes Vivaldi so clever and such a marvelous writer of these instrumental concerti, is clearly non-vocal in character. That's just something to keep in mind. Notice the kind of music. Vivaldi also wrote many very singable, extremely beautiful, melodically effulgent ritornelli, but this was not one of them. And I just think it's fascinating to understand that in addition to just the raw aspect of form, there is such a thing as idiomatic style for instruments versus voices. And that's something to keep in mind too. So there you go. A perfect little 7-part Baroque Ritornello form with 3 solos and 4 statements or partial statements of the Ritornello. You don't always get all of it, but you get most of it, enough to know that the solo's not playing and we're hearing the big tune from the beginning. That's all you need to know. So after that we have Vivaldi starts to expand on what he can do with his Ritornello forms. They're much larger when it comes to things like violin concerti, because violin concerti, the violin is not a wind instrument. It's not limited by the capacity of human breath and your lips getting tired. I mean, you get tired, but not quite as quick. So the violin concertos can be a little bigger, a little bit longer. They can do more things. And I want to play for you 2 movements from that most iconic of Vivaldi works, the 4 Seasons. Yes, we're going to hear the first movement of Spring. Now, the cool thing about Spring, about all these concertos, is that they are based on sonnets. They illustrate a poem, and that poem is what determines essentially what happens in the concerto, in the solos, and in the tutti, the non-solo episodes. Spring, the first movement. Dun dun bum bum ba da 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 dum ba da dum ba da da. It has 2 main themes to the Ritornello. There's that one, and then there's dum ba da da dum bum bum ba da 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 dum bum bum ba dum bum ba dum dum ba da da dum. You know those. So the Ritornello, when it returns, can use all of it or only a bit of it, one or the other of those tunes. And that's very handy because that means you have a natural climax if Vivaldi only uses half of the Ritornello for the other appearances and reserves the entire thing for the end, or mostly for the end. It's very, very clever how he manages these things. So we're going to listen to Spring. And because this is program music, the episodes represent things. There's birds for one of them. And then there's a poetic episode in the middle of a Ritornello, a babbling brook, but it's not a solo. It's actually part of a Ritornello. And then there's the thunderstorm, which is the next episode with the solo. And then there's a third episode, where it's just the birdies come back or something happens with more birds. And then we get the final Ritornello. I'm going to indicate again where the solo episodes of the Ritornelli are, so there won't be any possible confusion. So this is with L'Arte dell'Arco on Brilliant Classics in this unbelievably large Vivaldi edition of 66 CDs, which contains maybe a tenth of what the man wrote. It's unbelievable. But here is Spring. Now, spring, even though it's programmatic, follows our template fairly closely, reasonably closely. There are some exciting full instrumental bits within the solo episodes to, let the storm do its thing and whatnot, but basically it's pretty good. However, Summer, the first movement of Summer, has a fascinating approach to ritornello form because it's a movement in two tempi, two completely separate tempos. An opening slow tempo, which contains the ritornello, and a fast tempo, which contains the episodes, or some of them. And I'm not going to make a fool of myself trying to explain what it represents and what's happening. I just want you to listen to it, and I am going to play the whole thing through with the usual things, and you'll hear a totally different approach to the concept of ritornello form, even though, once again, there will be 3 main episodes with 4 tutti sections interspersed with them. And they're very obvious because they have their own tempo. So let's listen now to Summer, the first movement. Now, did you notice something unusual there? The unusual thing is that summer does not end with the ritornello at all. It ends with a completely independent coda, a tail, a tutti. It's still the full orchestra, but it's different music. Why? Because Vivaldi wanted to end with a bang. He didn't want to end with the slow, droopy music with which he began. And it would have made a very inappropriate ending, as I'm sure you can imagine. But the interesting thing here is that we now notice that the ritornello concept is more a principle than a literal rule that you're supposed to follow, no matter what. Come hell or high water, someone's going to do this to you. I think, no, it doesn't work that way at all. The musical values are always paramount, as with all great composers. But more to the point, the principle that you need to understand is solo versus tutti. Tutti meaning all, meaning the whole orchestra. Whether that tutti plays the actual melody of the ritornello or not is less important than the fact that it exists that way, that you have tutti, solo, tutti, solo, tutti, solo, tutti. So we still have 7 sections. We still have the same opposition between solo and full orchestra, but the material that those full orchestral sections consist of can vary, sometimes considerably. And that's another reason why you need to pay attention to each concerto as you hear it, because it may or may not follow our template, our boring little template. And the better you get to know this music, the more you realize that the template is only a very, very rough guide in detail, but a very, very reliable guide in principle. The principle being the opposition of solo to full orchestral forces. And so then we move on to one of Vivaldi's greatest admirers, Johann Sebastian Bach. And I'm going to play his harpsichord concerto, the first movement of the harpsichord concerto in A major. This is BWV 10, this is 1055, I think, or 1050. This is, again, I can't even see the bloody thing. Yeah, 1055. Now, the fascinating thing about the keyboard concerti is that Bach, of course, invented keyboard concerti, and they're a little bit problematic formally. Why? Because the harpsichord continuo is playing all the time anyway. So you start out with the harpsichord clanging along, then the harpsichord is solo, and then the harpsichord is clanging along. And even when the harpsichord is playing solo in the right hand, the left hand is still doing the continuo part, still filling in the harmony on the bottom, playing the bass line. So it can be somewhat difficult to determine when you're dealing with strictly a solo and when you're hitting a ritornello. But there's more to it than that, because in this particular concerto, Bach does something very, very interesting. What he does is he replaces the third appearance of the ritornello with what you can only call a development section, with fragmentary appearances of bits of the ritornello with increasingly florid and virtuosic writing for the keyboard. And they go back and forth and exchange and interchange. It's a long episode, a very long episode, but it's extremely important because this third solo, more or less, is effectively a development section. And after Bach, when the classical period got going and we got sonata form, where we have an exposition where you hear everything twice, that is the first 2 ritornellos, and then you have a development section and then a recapitulation at the end, you can hear how in Bach he's starting to move in gradual stages toward what became the classical concerto of Mozart and Beethoven. The idea of 3 solo episodes persisted well into the 19th century. It really, even though the form that justified it was long gone, was totally history. But here, in this marvelous, lovely little, it's just an enchanting, elegant movement with beautiful, beautiful exchanges between the orchestra and the solo. And it's very sensitively rendered here by Zuzana Ruzickova and Václav Neumann with the Czech Philharmonic. This is something that's going to drive the historically informed performance people crazy. But the musicality of the performance is never in doubt, and you'll hear just this wonderful, sometimes, is it a solo or isn't it? It's just amazing. And I'm going to play for you the entire movement, which again is about 4.5 minutes, and you'll hear where the solos and the tutis and all the stuff that's going on. It's just fascinating to hear how the music begins to evolve as that last solo episode and becomes more integrated into the ongoing dialogue with the orchestra. That developmental aspect of it, which is going to become such an important characteristic in both concertos and symphonic music. So here it is. exquisite music. Absolutely exquisite, but also enormously sophisticated and beautifully expressive. So gracious, the way that the orchestra, the strings and the harpsichord go back and forth and get along with each other. It's just beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But that is another aspect of ritornello form. And so you can see, I hope, from these examples and hear enormously clearly that Baroque ritornello form offered enormous possibilities, endless possibilities, fabulous possibilities that composers of genius took advantage of. It wasn't a straitjacket. It wasn't something that's formulaic. It was just the opposite. It was something that set composers' imaginations free. And the more you know about it, the more you know what to expect, the more fascinating it is when the music that you're actually hearing doesn't meet your expectation, your predisposition, where it goes off and does something fascinating, as all of these composers did regularly. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.